Thanks for joining us at 90s Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. There's a new drug that can really help treat Alzheimer's disease. And if you're unfamiliar with Alzheimer's disease, it is a devastating disorder that causes gradual memory loss, confusion, and debilitating effects. And there may be some new hope for the approximately 6 million Americans who are suffering from the effects from Alzheimer's disease. And joining us for a bit more about the drug Leqembi, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct.
You got
here.
it, yeah.
Leqembi, Dr. Payal Kohli, our 90s medical expert. Dr. Kohli, obviously this is potentially a very, very big deal for the 6 million Americans suffering with Alzheimer's disease. What do we know about Leqembi?
It's really become a game changer because for Alzheimer's, for so long, we have had nothing. Absolutely nothing. And this is the first drug that's actually shown what we call disease-modifying activity. So it's changing the trajectory of the disease, and it's changing the outcomes of the people that have Alzheimer's. And as you know, Alzheimer's is such a devastating illness. I mean, you really lose yourself as a person and lose your memories, lose everything that defines who you are. So for the Americans and their caregivers and family members who struggled with this condition for so long, this is really offering a lot of hope. And the way that it works, Chris, if you think about Alzheimer's, it's characterized by these plaques or protein deposits in our brain. And what this drug does is an antibody that goes in and sort of sops up those protein deposits. So it helps to remove the plaques from the brain. And that translates into a less of a cognitive decline in these patients that have Alzheimer's disease.
So is that what we're seeing? Is we're seeing reduced cognitive decline? Is it longer lasting? What are the positive impacts we're seeing from it?
That's right. So we're seeing less of a cognitive decline. The rate of cognitive decline is reduced by 27%. Now, I want to be sure to point out that this doesn't mean that you're getting improvement necessarily in your cognitive function. So you're not going to suddenly see grandma remembering a lot more. You'll just see her deteriorating more slowly. And a lot of the critics of the drug have actually really pointed out that it costs almost $27,000 a year.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's only reducing cognitive decline by about 27%. Now, is that clinically significant enough to justify not just the cost, but also the potential for side effects, as well as the fact that it's given intravenously? So you have to go every 2 weeks to an infusion center to get it. So when you're talking about somebody who has a disease like Alzheimer's, is it worth putting them through that? Sending them to an infusion center every 2 weeks to get this medication? Some would say absolutely, if it slows down the rate of decline. We also don't know in the long term if that 27% turns into a higher number as you follow them more over time and the curves really continue to separate, or do they just continue in parallel and does it sort of stay at 27%?
Are there any side effects aside from the ones you mentioned about the infusion? Are there any known side effects at this point?
There are, and these are significant as well. So some percentage of people will have brain swelling and some will have brain bleeding. And so actually the FDA has put a warning on the drug for anyone who's on blood thinners or anticoagulants that can increase the risk of bleeding. There's also genetic predispositions to complications. So ApoE4 is a gene that's been associated with Alzheimer's. And if you have 2 bad copies of this gene, you have a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's. And if you have 2 bad copies of this gene, you have a higher risk of having complications from Leqembi. So really putting the two together is the people that have Alzheimer's and potentially could be carrying these genes. So the FDA has actually recommended that they do genetic testing in people before initiating this medication to risk stratify them and determine who might be the highest risk from this drug having complications versus who might be able to get benefit.
Well, looking at the pros and cons, and you mentioned that there's been some debate about whether or not it's worth it. In your view, and I'm probably putting you on the spot a little bit, what do you think?
I think for the right person, it can be a game changer.
Okay.
And I think if we do genotyping, we exclude the people in anticoagulants, we exclude the people that have ApoE4 homozygosity, 2 copies, 2 bad copies. You really are selecting a group of people that are likely to benefit. And of course, as we continue to monitor, so this is the little grain of salt or the caveat on my comment is that there's always a race in medicine to try to get something out there quickly, especially for a condition like Alzheimer's where there is nothing. And we saw this during the pandemic. We want to get the science out there quickly. But the caveat and the flip side to that is we have to keep watching. You cannot just approve it, get it out there and forget about it. You have to make sure you continue to collect data so that we continue to learn what's happening to those individuals who do get it. The other piece, of course, is that the insurance companies, in my opinion, need to step it up because the cost can be prohibitive. And when it comes to a condition where you're losing your memory, yourself, you have dementia, it's not fair to make it so that people who are at the lowest socioeconomic statuses may not be able to potentially afford this medication. So we really have to figure out a way to bring that price point down. And I know research is expensive and everything, but I feel like the insurance companies and the drug companies really need to come to the table and say, for this particular condition, it's not a cosmetic procedure or something like that. It is literally a life-changing disease. We need to make this drug more affordable and more accessible.
And to that point, just to maybe enlighten us a little bit in terms of where the added cost comes from. You mentioned it's the research. Is that what's driving up the cost?
So, the drug companies, they spend a lot of money on R&D, research and development of the drug, and all the clinical trials and all that. They put out all that money. So when the drug gets approved by the FDA, they have a patent on it for a few years where nobody else can copy the drug and make a generic. And they can kind of market it the way that they want. They can set the price point, obviously, in discussion with the insurance companies about what they're willing to pay and really decide. Now, of course, as an IV infusion, it's obviously going to be more expensive than something oral. It's an antibody-based therapy, which also tends to be more expensive. But in other fields, like in cardiology, we have antibody-based therapies. We have therapies like this that have a substantially lower price point. So it still will be expensive, but I do think there is some room to move and some room to wiggle there. And whether that means infrastructural changes at the regulatory level, meaning the government has to subsidize the cost of the drug, or whether that means the drug company has to say we're going to eat this percentage of the cost, or whether the insurance companies say we're going to pay more because this disease is really important, just like with cancer or heart disease. These are not conditions that we can afford to not treat. And so I do think we have some work to be done even from the access standpoint.
Is the fact that there is now, you mentioned for the longest time that Alzheimer's was essentially, there was no treatments for it. The fact that there is now at least something that is moving in the right direction, does that open the door potentially for more treatments in the future?
It does. It really does, and it opens the door for hope and for people sort of realizing that they need to get the disease early. Now, this particular treatment is only for people with mild cognitive impairment, so that's really important. It's only very early in the disease that this drug has been studied and approved. Now, it may have some benefit later, but probably the benefit is going to be smaller because as you realize, when you get farther and farther along, the horse gets out of the barn, it gets much more difficult to establish substantial benefit. So philosophically, this tells me also that we need to do better at catching diseases earlier and starting treatment earlier. So this is a little bit of a paradigm shift as well, because oftentimes in medicine we're used to waiting till the disease declares itself significantly and then initiating therapy. But prevention, again, becomes very important. And for many of the Americans out there who worry about Alzheimer's, making sure that they're even doing the lifestyle measures that would help minimize their risk of developing Alzheimer's, talking up to their doctor about whether it makes sense to check their genes to see if they're predisposed to Alzheimer's, especially if they have a family history, because then they may even need to step up their preventive measures, possibly even more. And at the first sign that you may be developing the condition, to really be meeting with your doctor, do the neurocognitive testing, and really figure out what treatments are appropriate.
I guess anything else to add about Leqembi and what it might mean for Alzheimer's moving forward?
I'm really thrilled with the development, just because I think, like I said, we've struggled for so long. One of the interesting things about Leqembi and its approval is that, the FDA had actually considered an accelerated approval back in January. But the insurance companies refused to sort of pay for it because the FDA approval in January came up based on the fact that it was helping to sop up those plaques from the brain. And they said, well, we don't want to just see the plaques go away. We actually want to see that it's changing cognitive function. So we want to see the clinical effects of the drug. So this really does reflect how I think the FDA and the insurance companies continue to sort of struggle with, again, trying to get the science out there as quickly as possible. But the insurance companies saying, well, we really want to make sure that it's having a clinical impact. It's not just happening on a research level, that it's changing the biology in the brain, but we actually want to see if that translates into a clinical benefit. So lots of interesting ethical questions that have come up with Leqembi about cost, about access, about when to treat diseases. But again, in my opinion, really a big leap forward when it comes to Alzheimer's, and hopefully opens the door for other companies and other types of therapies for this disease.
Well, hopefully Leqembi, and this is mostly good news and good news moving forward. So Dr. Payal Kohli, thanks so much for your time here on 90s Plus today.